Snowflakes drifted lazily outside the old wooden window, landing silently on the frozen glass panes. The room was quiet except for the faint creak of the rocking chair, where Margaret sat, her trembling hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The winter air seemed to have crept inside her bones, not because of the temperature, but because of the words that had just left her son's lips. "Mom," Daniel said softly, almost too calmly, I need this house." Margaret looked up, startled. Her tired eyes searched his face for a trace of a joke, but there was none. The fire in the old brick fireplace hissed and spat, as if protesting what it had just heard. Her lips quivered. "This house? Daniel, what are you saying?" He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. He continued, his tone now edged with a rehearsed certainty. "We're thinking of renovating, maybe selling and moving to the city. It's closer to my work, better schools when we have kids." Margaret blinked, confused. The house, the home she and her late husband, Thomas, had built with every saved penny? The same house where Daniel had taken his first steps, where they celebrated birthdays under the creaky ceiling fan, where Thomas had taken his last breath holding her hand. She set her cup down, her fingers trembling. "Daniel, your father built this house for us, for our family. It's all we have left of him." "I know, Mom," he said quickly, running a hand through his hair. "But times change. We can't live in memories forever. Sophie thinks—" Margaret's voice rose before he could finish. "Sophie thinks? Since when does she decide what happens in my home?" There was a sudden silence. Daniel's jaw tightened. His voice, once gentle, turned colder than the air outside. "Mom, please don't make this difficult. Sophie is my wife now. We have plans. You could move somewhere quieter. Maybe that new elder home near the park. It's nice there, peaceful." For a moment, Margaret couldn't breathe. Her chest ached as if something inside her had cracked. "You want to send me away?" she whispered. "From the house where I raised you?" He didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the door where Sophie stood, pretending to check her phone, but clearly listening. Sophie stepped forward, her voice sweet and fake. "Mom, don't take it the wrong way. We're just worried about you. That place is beautiful. There's a garden, a library, people your age. You won't be lonely." Margaret stared at her son, trying to find the boy who used to hug her every night before bed, who cried when she scraped her knee, who once said, "I'll never leave you, Mom." But that boy was gone, replaced by a stranger in her son's skin. Outside, the snow thickened, burying the front yard in white silence. Inside, time stood still. Margaret reached for the small framed photo on the mantel, her and Thomas smiling in front of this very house 25 years ago. She remembered how he'd said, "Promise me, Maggie, never sell this house. It's our story." Her throat tightened. "Daniel, when your father died, this house was all I had left. Every wall, every brick carries a memory. You grew up here. Your laughter still echoes in these rooms. How can you take that away from me?" He sighed, frustrated. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not taking anything away. I'm just moving forward." Her voice broke. "And what about me? Where do I go when you move forward?" The silence that followed was worse than shouting. The wind howled against the windows as if the heavens themselves were mourning her fate. Sophie placed her hand on Daniel's arm. "Let's give her time," she said softly. "She'll understand." But Margaret knew what time meant. It meant days before she'd be pushed out, nights before her key no longer fit into the lock. And when that happened, no one would look back. As Daniel turned to leave, she whispered, "You've changed." He paused, his back to her. "Maybe," he said flatly, "but you'll thank me one day." The door closed behind him, the echo lingering in the cold air. Margaret sat there, staring at the flickering fire. Her heart was breaking quietly, without witnesses. In the glow of the dying embers, she whispered to the empty room, "Thomas, they want to take our home." Outside, snow fell endlessly, burying the footprints of the son who had just walked away. The next morning, the house felt emptier than ever. The cold wasn't just outside anymore. It had seeped into every corner of Margaret's home, crawling up the walls and settling deep into her chest. She moved slowly through the rooms, running her fingers along the wooden frames and faded curtains that once smelled of cinnamon in sunlight. The same curtains she had stitched by hand the year Daniel was born. Back then, she remembered, Thomas had laughed and said, "You've turned this house into a home, Maggie." Those words echoed now, haunting her more than comforting. As she entered Daniel's old room, she paused. The shelves still held his childhood trophies, little golden cups with his name engraved. Daniel Collins, Junior Science Fair winner. Daniel Collins, Best Essay Award. Her lips trembled as she smiled faintly, remembering how proud she used to be. She had worked double shifts at the local diner to buy him those books he wanted. She used to skip dinner sometimes so he could have enough for his school trips. Everything she had ever done, every sacrifice, was for him. And now, her own son wanted her gone. Margaret sat down on his old bed, the springs creaking softly beneath her. She stared out the frosted window where the snow still fell in heavy flakes. It was the same view she had watched with Thomas for years. They used to sit here, drinking tea, watching the seasons change, planning, dreaming, living. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she could almost hear his voice again. "Maggie," Thomas had said one night long ago as they painted the kitchen together. "One day, Daniel will grow up and have his own family. When that happens, promise me you'll always remind him what this home means. It's not just walls, it's love built in brick." Tears filled her eyes. She had promised, and she had kept that promise for years. But things began to change after Daniel's marriage. Sophie had arrived with polished smiles and perfect manners. At first, she'd been sweet, helping Margaret in the kitchen, laughing at her stories, calling her mom. Margaret had welcomed her with open arms, grateful that her son had found someone kind. But kindness can be a mask. It began subtly. Sophie started rearranging the house, moving furniture, changing curtains, replacing old things with new. She'd smile and say, "It's just to modernize things, Mom. You know how old-fashioned this place looks." Margaret said nothing. She tried to adapt, but little by little, it felt like Sophie was erasing her from her own home. Then came the whispers. At night, from her room, she could hear muffled conversations. Daniel's voice, sometimes raised, sometimes pleading. Then Sophie's soft tone, sharp, like a knife wrapped in silk. One evening, as Margaret passed by their door, she heard Sophie say, "Your mother doesn't even understand money, Daniel. This house could bring us a fortune. Why should she live alone here when she can be somewhere more appropriate?" She froze outside the door, her hand trembling against the wall. Appropriate? She wanted to scream that this was her house, that every inch of it carried her sweat and her husband's love. But she couldn't. She simply turned away, her heart heavy with disbelief. The distance between her and Daniel grew like an invisible wall. He no longer sat with her for dinner, no longer laughed at her stories, no longer hugged her goodnight. Even when she cooked his favorite stew, he barely touched it. Sophie, with her quiet smirk, had taken not just his attention, but his heart. Then, one cold evening, Sophie handed Margaret a glossy brochure. On the cover was a smiling elderly couple standing in front of a modern building with flowers and fountains. It's called Evergreen Haven, she said cheerfully, a lovely community for seniors. They take good care of people there. It's peaceful, and you'll make friends your age. She stared at her. You mean a home for old people? She laughed lightly. Don't say it like that. It's a resort, really. You deserve a break, Mom. You've worked all your life. Worked? Yes, she had worked, so they could live comfortably, so Daniel could have everything he ever wanted. And now that same work was being used as an excuse to send her away. That night, Margaret sat by the window, holding the brochure in her wrinkled hands. The smiling faces on the paper looked happy, but fake, soulless. She imagined herself there, alone, surrounded by strangers. No Thomas, no Daniel, no warmth of her kitchen, just silence. Her heart whispered, maybe it's time to leave before they push you. But another voice, fainter yet stronger, answered, no. This is your home. You belong here. The next morning, Daniel came to her with legal papers. His face looked tired, conflicted. Mom, he said, his voice low, it's just for formality. The property needs to be transferred to my name for tax reasons. Nothing will change. Margaret stared at the papers, her hands trembling. Transfer? Daniel, your father's name is on these deeds. Mine too. Why should I? He cut her off, his tone rising. Because it's the practical thing to do. Sophie's right. You don't understand how this works. For a moment, she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, of hesitation, but it vanished quickly. Her heart screamed that this wasn't her Daniel, not the boy who once cried when she burned her hand cooking his birthday cake. This was someone else, someone colder, lost. With a deep sigh, she picked up the pen. If it makes you happy, she said softly, signing her name where he pointed. That night, she sat alone staring at the fireplace. The shadows on the wall seemed to dance mockingly. She had just signed away everything, her home, her past, her future. Outside, the wind howled again, and for the first time, she didn't close the window. She let the cold in. Maybe she deserved to feel it. The day Margaret left her home, the sun never rose. It hid behind thick gray clouds, as if even the sky couldn't bear to watch what was about to happen. The air was heavy with the scent of snow and sorrow. She had packed her life into two small suitcases, one filled with clothes, the other with memories. Framed photos, Thomas's watch, Daniel's childhood drawings, and the old wedding album with the cracked leather cover. Everything else, every plate, every curtain, every piece of furniture belonged to the house now, not to her. Sophie stood at the doorway, her arms folded, dressed neatly in a cream sweater. She looks like someone seeing off a guest rather than family. Mom, the car is here, she said politely, her tone too calm for the moment. Margaret turned one last time to look around the living room. The walls still bore the faint marks of Daniel's height chart, the little pencil lines she had drawn every year, measuring how tall he'd grown. The worn-out rug still held faint stains from birthday cake frosting. Even the ticking clock on the wall sounded familiar, like the heartbeat of a home that was alive once, before greed infected it. Daniel appeared at the top of the staircase, adjusting his coat. He didn't meet her eyes. Mom, I've arranged everything. Evergreen Haven has excellent facilities. You'll like it there. Margaret forced a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. You talk as if I'm going on vacation. He sighed. Please, don't make this harder. She looked at him, her gaze deep and steady. Harder for who, Daniel? For you or for me? His lips pressed into a thin line. Mom, this is for your own good. Her voice cracked slightly as she whispered, "That's what everyone says before breaking someone's heart." Sophie cleared her throat, clearly wanting to end this scene. "Mom, you'll love it there. I even packed your shawl and your photo albums. And don't worry, we'll visit soon." Margaret smiled faintly. "You won't." There was a long silence. The ticking of the clock suddenly sounded deafening. Finally, she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door. Each step echoed through the hallway like a goodbye she hadn't agreed to. At the doorstep, she paused. Snowflakes drifted down softly, covering the front yard she used to plant tulips in every spring. Her hand brushed against the doorframe where Thomas had once carved their initials, T&M, forever. Her eyes filled with tears. Forever, she thought bitterly, was shorter than she imagined. Daniel stepped forward, awkwardly adjusting his scarf. "Take care of yourself, Mom," he said, trying to sound sincere. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers cold but gentle. "You'll understand one day, Daniel, when the person you love the most looks at you like a burden." He swallowed hard, but said nothing. The driver loaded her bags into the back of the car. Margaret climbed in slowly, her joints aching, her heart heavier than her luggage. As the car started to move, she looked through the window at her house, the roof dusted with snow, smoke rising faintly from the chimney, and Daniel standing in the doorway. For a brief second, she hoped he'd run after her, stop the car, say he was sorry. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching her disappear down the road like a stranger. The ride to Evergreen Haven was silent, except for the hum of the engine. Margaret clutched the shawl Thomas had given her on their 10th anniversary, the one she'd kept all these years. Every now and then, she'd glance at the brochure Sophie had given her. The smiling faces looked cruel now, mocking her pain. When the car finally stopped in front of the building, she stared out the window. Evergreen Haven was clean and modern. White walls, glass doors, and fake plants that looked too perfect. A large sign read, "A peaceful place to spend your golden years." She almost laughed. Golden years? There was nothing golden about being discarded. Inside, a young receptionist greeted her warmly. "Welcome, Mrs. Collins. We've prepared your room." Her cheerfulness felt rehearsed, empty. Margaret followed her through long corridors painted in soft pastel colors. The walls were lined with photographs of smiling old couples, each one a reminder of stories that probably began just like hers, with love and ended in loneliness. Her room was small but tidy. A single bed, a wooden dresser, and a window overlooking the garden. She sat down slowly, her suitcase beside her, feeling the walls close in. The silence here was different. Too clean, too final. Later that evening, one of the nurses knocked on her door. "Mrs. Collins, dinner's ready." Margaret shook her head. "I'm not hungry." The nurse smiled kindly. "It takes time to adjust. Don't worry. You'll make friends soon." When the nurse left, Margaret walked to the window and looked out. The garden lights flickered through the snow, casting long shadows. She saw other residents walking slowly, some with canes, some being pushed in wheelchairs. They looked peaceful, but she wondered how many of them were like her, victims of their children's convenience. She whispered to herself, "Thomas, I did everything for him. I gave him love, education, life. Why wasn't it enough?" Her voice trembled, lost in the emptiness of the room. A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was a man in his 50s wearing glasses and carrying a stack of papers. "Mrs. Collins, I'm Robert. I volunteer here on weekends, mostly help with legal paperwork. You must be new." Margaret nodded politely. "Yes, just arrived." Robert smiled. "If you ever need anything, advice, help, someone to talk to, My door's always open." She thanked him, not realizing that this stranger would soon change everything. That night, as the lights dimmed and the world outside turned white under the falling snow, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her son's voice echoed in her mind. "You'll thank me one day." A tear slipped down her cheek. "No, Daniel," she whispered. "One day, you'll thank me for teaching you what love really means." Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, a storm was beginning to rise in her heart. The next few weeks passed in a blur of silence and sorrow. Days blended into each other at Evergreen Haven, every morning starting with the same routine. The faint smell of disinfectant, the distant clatter of dishes from the cafeteria, and the hum of wheelchairs moving down the hall. Margaret would sit by the window, watching snow melt from the branches and drip like slow tears. She tried to smile at the nurses, to nod politely at the other residents, but inside she felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out her soul and left only the shell behind. She had never been the kind of woman to give up easily. She had fought through life's storms, the loss of her husband, the struggle to raise her son alone, the endless bills, and the quiet nights when loneliness had been her only companion. But this was a different kind of battle. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about betrayal, the kind that cuts deeper than any knife. One morning, she received a letter. The envelope was cream-colored, embossed with gold edges, and neatly addressed to Mrs. Margaret Collins. The handwriting was unfamiliar. When she tore it open, her eyes widened. It was a legal notice, a confirmation of the property transfer. The house was now officially under Daniel Collins' name. There was no mention of her ownership, no mention of the promises he'd made. Her hands trembled, the words blurred through her tears. How could he do this so quickly, she thought. Just weeks ago, she'd been sitting in her own kitchen, and now, on paper, as if she'd never existed there at all. The pain in her chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. She pressed her hand to her heart, whispering, "Thomas, they've erased me." That afternoon, Robert, the volunteer lawyer she'd met in the cafeteria, noticed her pale face in the cafeteria. "Mrs. Collins, are you all right?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Margaret hesitated. For days, she had kept everything bottled inside, ashamed of her own son's cruelty. But something in Robert's voice, the calm sincerity, broke the walls she'd built around her heart. She handed him the letter silently. He unfolded it, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the document carefully. His expression darkened. This doesn't look right," he murmured. "Did you have a legal advisor when you signed the transfer?" She shook her head slowly. "My son said it was just paperwork for taxes. He promised nothing would change." Robert exhaled sharply, anger flickering in his eyes. "That's how they get you. These documents, they're not about taxes. They're property deeds. Once you signed, he gained full ownership." Margaret's lips trembled. "So I have no rights now to my own home?" Robert hesitated. "Not exactly. If there was any manipulation, fraud, or coercion involved, and from what you're telling me there was, you have grounds to challenge it, especially if your husband's original will mentioned joint ownership." Margaret's heart raced. For the first time in weeks, a small spark of something stirred inside her. Not hope yet, but defiance. "Can I fight it?" she asked quietly. Robert smiled faintly. "If you're willing to fight, Mrs. Collins, I'll stand beside you." The next few days were filled with papers, calls, and quiet conversations in Robert's small office. Margaret brought him the old documents she'd kept in her suitcase, the will, the tax receipts, and even the faded photo of her and Thomas in front of the house. Every item, every detail became a piece of evidence in the puzzle of her stolen life. As they worked, Robert grew to admire her strength. Despite her age, despite her heartbreak, Margaret spoke with determination, her voice trembling at times, but never breaking completely. I don't care about money. I just want to protect what Thomas built, what we built. One evening, as they sat reviewing the documents, Robert leaned back in his chair. We'll need to file an official complaint, he said. It'll go to court. It might take some time. Margaret nodded, her fingers gripping the armrest. I've waited my whole life for people to do the right thing. I can wait a little longer for justice. But deep inside, she feared what would happen when Daniel found out. Would he retaliate? Would he come to see her? Not with love, but with anger. The thought of facing him again sent a chill down her spine. Yet she knew it was inevitable. The next week, her fears became reality. Daniel stormed into Evergreen Haven one morning, his face flushed with rage. "Mom, what are you doing?" he shouted, drawing stares from the staff. "You're suing me? Your own son?" Margaret stood from her chair slowly, her voice calm but steady. "I'm not suing my son. I'm standing up for my husband, for myself, and for what's right." He scoffed. "You've been talking to that lawyer, haven't you? That man is filling your head with nonsense. You don't know what you're doing." Her eyes met his, and for the first time in years, he looked away first. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said quietly. "You took my home, Daniel, but you won't take my dignity." Sophie arrived minutes later, trying to calm him down, pretending to look sympathetic. "Mom, you're making this worse for yourself. Everyone will think you're bitter and confused. Why don't you just let it go?" She smiled sadly, "Because when I let things go, people like you win." That night back in her room, she sat by the window as the first spring rain began to fall. Each drop struck the glass like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. She knew the battle ahead would not be easy, but she also knew she was not the weak, fragile woman they thought she was. She was Thomas's wife, she was Daniel's mother, and she had one final fight left in her. She whispered into the night, "You wanted me gone, Daniel, but you've just given me a reason to stay standing." Outside, thunder rumbled, not a sound of fear this time, but of something awakening. That night, the house was unusually silent. The ticking clock on the wall echoed louder than usual, counting down the seconds of Evelyn's peace. She sat in her husband's old rocking chair near the fireplace, clutching a faded photograph, a younger version of herself standing beside Richard, their newly built home glowing behind them. The warmth of those days felt like another lifetime. The wind outside howled, rattling the window panes, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside her heart. She didn't know that in the next room, Daniel and Sophie were whispering in low voices. "She won't agree easily," Sophie said, her tone calm but edged with frustration. "You'll have to make her believe it's for her own good." Daniel rubbed his temples, guilt flickering in his eyes. "Sophie, she loves this house. She and Dad built it from nothing. I can't just—" "You can," Sophie interrupted sharply, stepping closer. "We've already put the down payment on the new place. That money depends on this house. If she keeps holding on to it, we'll lose everything. And you know she can't live alone forever." Her voice softened as she placed her hand on his arm, her manipulation wrapped in affection. "You're her son, Daniel. She trusts you. Just make her understand." Daniel exhaled shakily. He didn't want to be the villain, but Sophie's words wrapped around his mind like vines, slowly choking reason. "Fine," he whispered. "I'll talk to her tomorrow." The next morning, Evelyn woke early to the sound of rain. She prepared breakfast as she always did, tea, eggs, and toast, humming an old tune Richard used to love. When Daniel entered the kitchen, his eyes darted around nervously. "Mom," he began, forcing a smile, "can we talk?" She looked up from the stove, her gentle face lighting up. "Of course, dear. Sit down. Are you all right?" He hesitated, his heart pounding. "How do I do this?" he thought, but Sophie's voice echoed in his head. "Be firm. Make it sound like you're protecting her." So he did. Mom, he said, sitting across from her, you've been here alone since Dad passed. I've been thinking, maybe it's time you move somewhere more comfortable, somewhere with people your age. There's a really nice community nearby. Evelyn froze mid-stir, her spoon clinking against the cup. A community? She repeated softly. You mean an old age home? Daniel swallowed. It's not like that. It's safer. You'll have people to talk to, activities. Her eyes met his, calm but piercing. And what about my home, Daniel? The one I built with your father's hands. He couldn't look at her. Mom, it's not practical for you anymore. The maintenance, the space, it's too much. Sophie and I, her voice sharpened slightly. Sophie and you want the house. Daniel's head shot up, guilt flashing across his face. It's not like that, Mom. We just thought. Don't lie to me, she said quietly, setting her cup down. Your father used to say, a lie is heavier than the truth. You can't carry it long. For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain outside grew heavier, pounding against the windows. Then Evelyn sighed, her shoulders sinking. You want this house, Daniel? Fine. Take it. But remember this. Walls can't love you. Bricks don't bless you. This house holds your father's soul. If you sell it, you're selling him. Her voice trembled now. I thought I raised a man who'd understand that. Daniel stood abruptly, his eyes burning. You don't understand, Mom. I have my own family now. I can't keep living under your memories. The words came out harsher than he intended. Evelyn flinched as if struck. For a moment, neither recognized each other. After he stormed out, she sank into her chair, tears finally falling. She whispered to the empty air, Richard, our boy's gone astray. What did I do wrong? The photo frame on the mantel seemed to stare back at her. Richard's kind eyes, forever frozen in time, unable to answer. That night, Evelyn barely slept. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper fragments of the past, laughter, footsteps, lullabies. She wandered through the halls like a ghost, tracing her fingers along the faded wallpaper, remembering the day they'd painted it together. She paused by the window, watching as Daniel's car headlights disappeared into the storm. He doesn't understand, she murmured, but someday he will. Meanwhile, in the car, Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Guilt gnawed at him, but Sophie's words replayed again and again. You're doing what's best for her. He told himself that lie until he almost believed it. Days passed. The house grew quieter. Evelyn could feel the distance widening, not just in words but in hearts. The dinners were shorter, the laughter fewer, the warmth fading. She started keeping to her room, spending hours staring at the old family album. Every picture told a story of love that now felt lost. She didn't realize Sophie had already started making calls to a real estate agent. Then one morning, Evelyn overheard them. Their voices came from the living room, sharp, hushed, but clear. We'll finalize the deal next week. Once the documents are signed, she can't do anything. Evelyn froze in the hallway, her breath catching. She felt her knees weaken, clutching the wall for support. The world blurred as realization struck. They weren't just talking, they were planning to take her home. When she stepped into the room, both froze. Finalize what deal? Evelyn's voice was cold, almost unfamiliar. Sophie's eyes widened, but she quickly smiled. Oh, Mrs. Evelyn, we were just discussing. Don't, Evelyn interrupted. Don't lie to me in my own house. Her voice cracked, but carried strength. She turned to her son. Daniel, look at me. He did, reluctantly. Is it true? Silence. That silence was her answer. Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes glistening, but her voice calm. Then may God forgive you both. Because I already have. She turned away, her tears falling freely now. You may take the house, but one day you'll understand what it cost you. And with that, she walked toward her room, each step heavier than the last. She didn't know that this betrayal would lead her not to despair, but to the courtroom where truth would finally speak for her. The courtroom was a cavern of whispers and polished wood, a place that smelled faintly of old paper and colder truths. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table beside Robert, her heart beating like a slow drum under her shawl. She had never imagined herself here, not at 82, not against her own flesh and blood. The murmur of lawyers, the shuffle of shoes, the clinking of pens, it all sounded distant, like echoes in a dream she desperately wanted to wake from. Across the room sat Daniel and Sophie. They looked composed, dressed impeccably, Sophie in a gray suit, her hair pulled back tightly, her lips set in a calm smile that never reached her eyes. Daniel avoided looking at his mother. He stared down at the documents on the table, flipping through them as if he could bury himself inside the pages. Margaret studied his face quietly. Even now, she couldn't hate him. He was her son, her only child. The same boy she once sang to sleep, the same boy who used to run to her when thunder frightened him. But the man sitting across from her was no longer that boy. "Mrs. Collins," Robert whispered softly, noticing the tremor in her hand. "Are you ready?" She nodded faintly. "I've been ready since the day he took my home." The judge entered, a tall man with silver hair and a stern expression. The gavel struck once, and silence fell over the courtroom like snow. Case number 2047, Margaret Collins versus Daniel Collins, property dispute. Hearing those words out loud sent a chill down her spine. Her name, against her own son's. It felt like a curse. Daniel's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Mr. Harris, stood first. His voice was smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, this case is a misunderstanding at best. My client's mother willingly transferred ownership of the house to her son. There was no coercion, no fraud. She signed the papers in full awareness, and now she seeks to undo that decision because of emotional dissatisfaction." Robert stood next. His tone was calm but carried weight. "Your Honor, we will prove that Mrs. Collins was misled. She was deceived under the guise of family trust. The defendant used emotional manipulation to obtain control over property that was rightfully hers and her late husband's legacy." Margaret listened, her heart aching with every word. Family trust. How ironic that the very thing she built her life upon had been weaponized against her. The judge looked between them. "Let's proceed. Mrs. Collins, can you approach the stand?" Margaret rose slowly, her cane tapping softly against the marble floor. The walk to the witness stand felt endless. Every step carried memories. Daniel's laughter, Thomas's promises, her own sacrifices. She took the oath with the trembling hands and sat down. Robert began gently. "Mrs. Collins, can you tell a court about the house in question?" She took a deep breath. "That house was built by my husband, Thomas Collins, nearly 40 years ago. He was a carpenter, a good one. We built it brick by brick with our own hands. Every corner of it held a piece of our lives. My husband passed away there, in the same room where we shared our first morning together. It wasn't just a house. It was my life." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "After his death, I raised our son Daniel there. I worked long hours, sometimes skipped meals, but I made sure he never lacked anything. I thought love was enough to make him remember what that home stood for." Robert nodded. "And what happened after Daniel got married?" Margaret's eyes flicked briefly towards Sophie. At first, everything was fine, but slowly, things changed. I started feeling like a guest in my own house. They moved my things, changed my furniture, made decisions without me. Then one day, Daniel brought me papers to sign. He said it was for tax reasons. I trusted him. I didn't know I was signing my home away. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge watched her closely. Robert handed her a document. Is this the paper you signed? She adjusted her glasses, tears blurring her vision. Yes, that's my signature. Robert looked at the judge. Your Honor, the plaintiff's signature is present, but the notary stamp is missing. This indicates it was not properly authenticated. Furthermore, evidence will show that Mrs. Collins was under emotional duress and was misinformed about the purpose of this document. Mr. Harris rose quickly. Objection! The plaintiff is clearly confused. She's elderly, and memory can be unreliable at that age. Robert's voice turned sharp. Objection to that insult, Your Honor. Age does not equate to incompetence. The judge raised his hand. Enough. Continue. Margaret sat quietly as the lawyers debated. She looked over at Daniel again. For a brief second, their eyes met. There was something flickering there. Guilt, perhaps, but it vanished quickly when Sophie whispered something to him. When Robert finished questioning her, the defense began. Mr. Harris approached, his tone dripping with false politeness. Mrs. Collins, is it true that your son and daughter-in-law cared for you for years? Yes, she replied softly. And is it true that they offered you a comfortable new residence where your needs would be looked after? She hesitated. They offered me a place, yes, but not a home. Mr. Harris smiled slightly, circling like a predator. And you signed those papers willingly, didn't you? She looked him dead in the eye. I signed them because I trusted my son. But no one forced you, he pressed. She looked him dead in the eye. Love can force more than any hand ever could. A ripple of whisper spread through the spectators. Even the judge's face softened for a moment. Mr. Harris looked unsettled, but he quickly stepped back. When the session ended, the judge announced, the court will reconvene tomorrow for the next hearing. Mrs. Collins, please rest. These matters are heavy. As everyone began leaving, Margaret remained seated for a moment, staring at the gavel resting on the judge's desk. It looked so small, yet it carried the power to decide her fate. She whispered quietly, Justice isn't about winning, Thomas. It's about being heard. Robert placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You were perfect today, he said gently. She nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on her son, walking out of the courtroom, hand in hand with Sophie, the woman who had replaced her in her own child's heart. But Margaret's steps were lighter when she left that day. For the first time, she felt the faint warmth of purpose. The house might have been stolen, but her voice, her truth, still belonged to her. Outside, the winter's sun broke through the clouds for the first time in months, lighting the courthouse steps in gold. The next morning, the courthouse felt colder, even though the winter sun shone brighter through the tall windows. Margaret arrived early, leaning on her cane, wrapped in the same shawl she had knitted decades ago, back when Daniel was still small enough to fall asleep in her lap. Every thread of that shawl carried his childhood laughter, his dreams, his promises. Today, it carried her trembling strength. Robert met her at the entrance, holding a folder thick with papers. You don't have to be nervous, he said kindly. We'll handle everything. Just speak your truth, like yesterday. Margaret smiled faintly. The truth is all I have left, Robert. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. There were more people today, journalists, curious onlookers, maybe even neighbors who once saw Margaret as the sweet old lady who baked pies and tended her roses. Now they whispered about her as the mother suing her son. Across the aisle, Daniel looked tired. He hadn't slept much. The guilt was gnawing at him. Sophie sat beside him, calm and cold, her eyes sharp like blades. She leaned toward him and whispered, "Don't look at her too much. It'll make you weak." Daniel nodded numbly, but his hands fidgeted, betraying the turmoil inside. When the judge entered, everyone stood. His gaze swept across the room, then briefly paused on Margaret. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression. Surprise, recognition, maybe? But he quickly masked it with professionalism. The session began with Robert calling their first witness, Mrs. Elizabeth Monroe, an old neighbor who had lived next to Margaret for 30 years. She walked to the stand, her hands clutching her purse. "Mrs. Monroe," Robert began, "you've known Mrs. Collins for a long time, correct?" "Yes, since Daniel was a little boy," she said with a fond smile toward Margaret. "We used to have tea every Sunday." "Can you tell the court what you witnessed on the day Mrs. Collins signed the property papers?" Elizabeth hesitated. "I remember that day. Daniel came home with some papers. Margaret looked confused, but Daniel said it was something to protect the house from high taxes. She didn't want to sign at first, but he insisted. Sophie told her it was for her own good." Robert nodded. "Did Mrs. Collins seem fully aware that she was giving up ownership?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No, she looked worried. She kept asking, 'Are you sure this won't take the house away from me?' And Daniel just hugged her and said, 'Mom, you worried too much.'" A quiet murmur spread through the room. Mr. Harris stood up sharply. "Mrs. Monroe, you're quite old yourself, aren't you? Perhaps your memory isn't entirely reliable." Elizabeth's eyes flashed. "Old doesn't mean stupid, young man. I know what I saw." The audience chuckled quietly until the judge called for order. Robert smiled softly. "Thank you, Mrs. Monroe. That will be all." When she stepped down, Margaret reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Lizzie," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. Next, Robert presented a document, a forensic handwriting analysis showing the signature on the deed was indeed Margaret's, but the accompanying text had been altered after she signed. Words were added, technical legal phrasing that turned what she thought was a temporary transfer into a full property ownership handover. Robert looked straight at the judge. "Your Honor, this evidence shows clear fraud. The document was manipulated after my client's signature was obtained under false pretenses." The judge leaned forward, examining the paper closely. His brow furrowed. "Where did this analysis come from?" "An independent expert," he replied. "He'll testify tomorrow." Mr. Harris jumped up, clearly rattled. "Your Honor, this so-called analysis is nothing but speculation." "Sit down, Mr. Harris," the judge said firmly. His voice had an edge this time. "We will examine it properly tomorrow." Margaret's heart pounded. For the first time, she saw the faintest shadow of justice forming. During the short recess, she caught Daniel standing alone near the window, his face pale. She walked over slowly. "Daniel," she said softly. He turned, startled. "Mom, you shouldn't." "I just wanted to ask one thing," she interrupted gently. "When you brought me those papers, did you know what they really were?" Daniel hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Sophie said it was safe. She said we'd still take care of you." "She said," Margaret repeated sadly. "You've always let others do your thinking for you." "Mom, please," he whispered, glancing nervously toward Sophie. "This isn't easy for me." Margaret's eyes glistened. "It was never supposed to be easy, Daniel. It was supposed to be right. Before he could answer, Sophie appeared, her smile tight. We should get back, Daniel. You don't want to upset the judge. As they walked away, Robert joined Margaret again. You okay? She nodded faintly, though her hands trembled. It hurts to see how lost he's become. I don't recognize him anymore. When court resumed, Sophie was called to the stand. She walked gracefully, her heels echoing sharply on the floor, every step calculated. Her expression was poised, her voice steady. Mrs. Collins, Robert began, you were present when Margaret signed these documents, correct? Yes, she knew what she was signing. Did you explain to her that it was a permanent transfer of ownership? She didn't ask. We assumed she trusted her son. Robert tilted his head slightly. So you relied on her trust to take her house? Her jaw clenched. We didn't take anything. We simply made the best decision for the family. For the family, Robert repeated quietly. And where does Mrs. Collins fit into that family now? Sophie hesitated, just for a second. She has a place in a retirement home where she'll be cared for. That's more than enough. The judge's expression hardened. His gaze lingered on Sophie, longer this time. There was a flicker of something in his eyes again, a strange discomfort, as though he was seeing a ghost from his own past. As court adjourned for the day, Margaret stood slowly. The judge called after her unexpectedly. Mrs. Collins, he said, his tone softer than before. Would you stay a moment? Everyone paused. Even Sophie turned to look, startled. The judge waited until the room was nearly empty before he spoke again, stepping down from the bench. His voice trembled slightly. Margaret Collins, were you married to Thomas Collins, the carpenter? Margaret blinked, confused. Yes, I was. Did you know him? The judge nodded slowly, his eyes misting over. He built my parents' house when I was a boy. I remember him speaking about you, said you were the strongest woman he'd ever known. Margaret's lips parted in shock. For the first time, she saw kindness behind the gavel. I'm sorry, the judge said quietly. I had no idea who you were when this case began. Margaret managed a trembling smile. Then maybe, Your Honor, now you'll understand what that house means to me. He nodded solemnly. I do, and I promise you, the truth will be seen. As she left the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter, warmer. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt the universe tilt just slightly, back in her favor. That night, the city slept under a blanket of snow, but in the judge's chamber, lights still burned. Judge Whitaker sat at his desk, the case file open before him. Margaret Collins. The name stirred something deep in his chest. He could still remember being a scrawny teenager, watching her husband, Thomas, hammer away at his family's porch. He remembered her laughter echoing down the street, the smell of her apple pies drifting from their kitchen window. That home had been a symbol of love, hard work, and devotion, the kind that seemed almost extinct now. And yet, here he was, reading about that same house being stolen by the very child who grew up in its walls. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Something about the case didn't sit right. The documents looked polished, yes, too polished. Sophie's statements felt rehearsed. Daniel's guilt was written all over his face. He'd seen families fight over property before, but there was something colder about this one, something calculated. Pulling his glasses off, he sighed and reached for the phone. Clara, he said to his clerk, I need you to pull every transfer record for 18 Willow Street from the last 10 years. And, quietly, I don't want this leaking out. By the next morning, as Margaret walked up the courthouse steps again, she felt something strange. Hope. It scared her a little. Hope had betrayed her once before, when Daniel promised, Mom, you'll always have a place here. But Robert's confidence, the judge's softened tone, they were tiny lights in her darkness. Inside, Sophie looked more tense than usual. Her smile was thinner, her eyes darting toward the judge repeatedly. Daniel seemed quieter too, his hand fidgeting with his tie. He hadn't spoken to his mother since their short exchange yesterday. Her words had pierced him more than she knew. When the hearing began, the atmosphere was heavier, quieter. The judge's gaze lingered on the defense table longer than usual before speaking. "We'll begin with testimony from the document expert," he announced. A man in his 60s took the stand, Mr. Lawson, an expert in document verification. He explained calmly, using enlarged copies on a projector. "The signature is genuine, but the text surrounding it was modified. You can see here, different ink density, mismatched alignment. The addition was made post-signature, likely after the document was scanned." Robert nodded. "So you're saying Mrs. Collins didn't sign this version of the document?" "Correct," Lawson replied. "She signed something else entirely." A ripple of gasps filled the room. The judge's eyes flicked toward Sophie. "Do you have any explanation for this, Mrs. Collins?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked briefly at Daniel, silently pleading for him to speak. But he didn't. He just stared down at the table, shame washing over his face. Mr. Harris jumped up, flustered. "Your Honor, this could be a clerical mix-up, a scanning error even." Lawson calmly shook his head. "It's not an error. It's deliberate tampering." The judge's voice hardened. "Are you suggesting the document was altered intentionally, Counselor?" Mr. Harris stammered, I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor." "Good," the judge replied coldly, "because that would constitute fraud." The courtroom went silent. Margaret felt her breath catch. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. Someone was finally listening. Sophie's mask began to crack. She leaned toward Daniel, whispering harshly, "Say something! Defend us!" Daniel's voice came out weak. I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought what?" Robert cut in sharply. "You thought your mother's trust was a loophole to exploit." "Objection," Harris shouted. "Overruled," the judge said without hesitation. "Let him answer." Daniel's face turned pale. I just wanted to make things easier. Sophie said it was the best way to protect the property legally. She said Mom wouldn't understand the paperwork." "And you believed her?" Robert asked quietly. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "She's my wife. I wanted to believe she was right." Margaret watched him break, her heart shattering and softening at the same time. She had wanted justice, yes, but not this way. Seeing him crumble felt like losing him all over again. The judge took off his glasses and sighed deeply. "Mr. Collins, what you did, whether intentional or not, caused serious harm. But Mrs. Sophie Collins, your manipulation runs deeper. You forged trust, tampered with documents, and tried to justify it as practicality. That's cruelty disguised as logic." Sophie straightened, defiance even in disgrace. "I did what was necessary. We have a life to build. That old house was nothing but a memory. I wasn't going to let sentiment drag us down." Margaret's voice broke the silence. Soft, trembling, but clear. "That old house was my life. It's where I gave birth to your husband. It's where his father's laughter still echoes. You call it sentiment. I call it love. And if love means nothing to you, then you've already lost more than any property could ever give." The courtroom froze. Even the judge seemed momentarily speechless. Sophie's eyes glistened with fury, but behind it was fear. The perfect mask she wore was cracking fast. Robert turned to the judge. "Your Honor, based on the evidence, it's clear Mrs. Collins was deceived and her property unlawfully transferred. We request immediate suspension of ownership rights pending a full investigation." Judge Whitaker nodded slowly. "Motion granted." The sound of his gavel striking wood echoed through the chamber, a sound that felt like thunder breaking chains. Sophie's face drained of color. Daniel buried his face in his hands. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Thomas. We're almost home." But the moment was bittersweet. As people began filing out, the judge called Robert to his bench privately. "Counselor," he said, his tone serious, "there's more to this case than what's been presented. The transfer records show 2 hidden accounts linked to the sale, one under Sophie's name, another under Daniel's. Money moved shortly after the house was transferred. I need your discretion, but I can't ignore this." Robert's eyes widened. "That changes everything," he said. "It does," the judge said quietly. "Tomorrow we end this properly." Outside, snowflakes drifted gently over the courthouse steps. Margaret stood watching them, her breath misting in the cold air. Daniel and Sophie walked past her silently. For the first time, Sophie didn't look victorious. She looked cornered. Daniel paused, his lips trembling. "Mom, I'm sorry." Margaret looked at him for a long time, then simply said, "So am I, son." Her eyes turned toward the courthouse windows glowing in the dusk. Tomorrow would be the final hearing, and whether she won or lost, Margaret knew one thing. Truth had already begun to thaw the frost in everyone's hearts. The morning of the final hearing dawned gray and heavy, as though the clouds themselves understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Margaret woke before sunrise, sitting by the small window of the modest room Robert had arranged for her near the courthouse. She watched the snow drift lazily down, covering everything in white, soft, pure, and silent. It was strange, she thought, how something so cold could look so peaceful. She wrapped her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and whispered to the empty room, "Thomas, if you can hear me, let today bring peace." When she arrived at the courthouse, the air inside felt different, tense. Reporters crowded outside the doors, flashes going off as they shouted questions. This wasn't just another property dispute anymore. The story of an elderly mother betrayed by her own son had captured hearts across the city. People called it the House on Willow Street trial. Some came out of sympathy, others out of morbid curiosity, but all eyes were on Margaret as she walked past, fragile yet unbroken. Daniel and Sophie were already seated. Daniel's face was pale, his eyes ringed with sleepless guilt. Sophie, though composed, carried an unease she couldn't hide. The faint twitch of her hands, the way her jaw tightened every time the judge glanced her way. Robert stood ready, a quiet determination burning in his eyes. When Judge Whitaker entered, the room hushed completely. His expression was calm, but there was a heaviness behind his gaze, the weight of something deeply personal. He adjusted his glasses and began. "Before we proceed, I'd like to disclose that I've reviewed additional records related to this case. What I found is deeply troubling." The courtroom collectively inhaled. He continued, his voice firm but restrained. "The financial records connected to the transfer of 18 Willow Street revealed 2 undisclosed accounts, one in Mrs. Sophie Collins' name and another under Mr. Daniel Collins. Both received large deposits from a third party immediately following the transfer, funds equivalent to the full estimated value of the house." Sophie's head snapped up. "That's not possible," she blurted, her voice cracking. The judge didn't flinch. "Mrs. Collins, are you denying that these accounts exist?" I don't know anything about that. It must be a mistake." Robert stepped forward, producing a printed statement. "Your Honor, we subpoenaed these bank records late last night after your office's request. The transactions are verified. The money was moved through an intermediary real estate firm registered under Sophie's maiden name. The room buzzed like a hive. The judge's tone sharpened. Mrs. Sophie Collins, do you wish to revise your earlier testimony, or would you prefer we bring in a fraud investigator? Sophie's face drained of color. I I didn't mean for it to go this far, she muttered, her voice trembling. Margaret sat frozen. Every word felt like a dagger. She had suspected betrayal, but this was premeditated theft. Her son and his wife hadn't just taken her house, they had sold it behind her back for profit. Daniel looked horrified. You did what? He hissed at Sophie, disbelief in his eyes. She turned on him, desperate now. I did it for us, Daniel, for our future. You were too weak to make decisions, so I did what was needed to be done. For our future? He repeated bitterly. You ruined everything for money. The argument exploded in front of everyone. The courtroom that had once been silent now buzzed with murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. The judge banged his gavel. Order! The sound cut through the chaos like thunder. Robert turned toward Margaret, his voice steady but emotional. Mrs. Collins, after everything you've endured, is there anything you'd like to say to the court or to your son? Margaret rose slowly, gripping her cane for balance. Her voice trembled, but it carried through the silent room. When a mother gives birth to a child, she gives him not just life, but her own soul. Every meal missed, every tear hidden, every dream postponed, it's all for him. I never wanted riches or recognition. I only wanted my son to have a good life, to grow into a kind man. When Thomas died, I thought at least I still had Daniel, that the house we built together would one day hold his children's laughter. She paused, her eyes glistening as she looked at Daniel. But I was wrong. I didn't lose my home the day he took it from me. I lost it the day he stopped seeing me as his mother. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even Sophie's defiance faded into shame. Margaret continued, her tears streaking her cheeks. You took my walls, my memories, my husband's legacy. But you couldn't take my love for you, Daniel. That's something no paper can sign away. You'll understand someday. Maybe when your own child turns away from you. Daniel broke down then, the weight of everything collapsing on him. Mom, I didn't know she was selling it. I swear, I just thought. Margaret raised a trembling hand, silencing him gently. It doesn't matter anymore. The truth is out. That's all I ever wanted. Judge Whitaker's eyes were wet as he cleared his throat. Mrs. Collins, I have presided over countless cases, but rarely have I seen such betrayal within a family. The court finds that the property transfer of 18 Willow Street was obtained through fraud and coercion. Ownership shall be fully restored to you, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am forwarding this case to the district attorney for review of potential criminal charges related to document falsification and financial fraud. The gavel struck once, sharp, final. For a moment, no one moved. Margaret stood perfectly still, staring at the judge, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. Then slowly, a smile broke across her face, soft and tired, but real. The kind of smile that comes after years of silence finally being broken. Daniel sobbed quietly, burying his face in his hands. Sophie sat frozen, realizing her empire of lies had finally crumbled. As Margaret stepped outside the courthouse, flashes exploded around her, but she barely noticed. Snowflakes landed gently on her hair. She looked up at the gray sky, whispering, "We did it, Thomas. We got our home back." Robert joined her, smiling faintly. Justice doesn't always come fast, but it came. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Sometimes justice just needs someone to remember the truth. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Daniel followed a few paces behind. He didn't say a word, but when Margaret turned to glance back, their eyes met. For the first time, she didn't see anger or betrayal, but just a broken man realizing what love he had destroyed. She gave him a faint nod, not a forgiveness, but a farewell. The snow fell harder now, blanketing the world in white, a new beginning rising quietly from the ruins of heartbreak. The courtroom fell into a silence so heavy it could break bones. Every eye in that hall was fixed on the trembling old woman standing near the witness stand, Evelyn. Her frail hands clutched a worn-out photograph of a young couple in front of a half-built house, the house that had once been her dream. The judge, a man known for his stoicism, had gone pale, his hand frozen mid-air above the desk. The moment he looked at her, his breath caught. Because he knew her. Or rather, he knew the woman she used to be. Years ago, she was the one who had donated money for his late wife's treatment. The kindness that had once saved his family was now standing before him, broken, betrayed, and pleading for a home. The irony hit him like a storm. Evelyn didn't know that this man, Judge Harrison, had once sworn to return every favor life owed to her. And now fate had brought her to him, not as a benefactor, but as a victim. Across the room, Daniel, her son, sat rigid, avoiding her eyes. He had thought this hearing would be simple, just a legal formality, to transfer ownership of the family home to his name. He hadn't expected his mother to appear in court, nor had he expected his wife, Sophie, to twist the story so convincingly, painting Evelyn as a confused, unstable woman who no longer knew what was best for herself. Sophie had rehearsed every line, every tear, every sigh of concern. "She's old, Your Honor," Sophie said softly, gripping Daniel's hand. "She forgets things. She needs care, not property." Daniel nodded, though guilt tightened around his throat like a noose. But when Evelyn spoke, her voice, though aged, carried a fire that silenced every whisper in the courtroom. "Forgetfulness?" she said, her eyes never leaving her son. "Do you remember who built that house, Daniel? Who painted its walls while carrying you inside her belly? Who planted every flower in that garden because she dreamed you would play there one day?" Her voice cracked and tears slipped down her cheeks. "And now you want to sell it? You call it your house? The same one where your father's laughter still echoes in my heart?" The words struck the air like thunder. Sophie looked away. Daniel's eyes glistened, but he said nothing. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, his voice steady but emotional. "Mrs. Evelyn," he said gently, "do you have any evidence that proves the house belongs to you?" Slowly, Evelyn opened her handbag and pulled out a faded document, its edges curled and yellow. "This," she said, "was signed by my husband, Richard, the deed. It says the house belongs jointly to both of us, and that after his passing, ownership remains with me. I didn't understand law then, but I remember his words. You'll always have a home, Evelyn." She placed the paper before the judge, her hand trembling. The moment Harrison read the signatures, his face hardened. It was legitimate. Sophie's composure cracked. "She's lying!" she cried out, standing abruptly. "She's making this up. That document's old. It doesn't matter anymore." The judge turned to her sharply. "Sit down, Mrs. Daniel. The document is valid until proven otherwise." Daniel lowered his head. Shame burned through him like wildfire. He could no longer meet his mother's gaze. In that instant, he realized what he had done, how greed and Sophie's gentle manipulation had blinded him. The very home that once smelled of cinnamon and his mother's laughter had become a battlefield of betrayal. As the proceedings continued, Evelyn's eyes drifted toward the window. Snowflakes fell outside, the same kind of snow that had covered the night Daniel asked her for the house. She remembered standing in that cold wind, her hands numb, listening to her son's words. "Mom, I need the house in my name." She smiled then, trusting him. She never thought those words would lead her here, a courtroom, a fight for her dignity, for the memory of her husband. Judge Harrison looked down at his notes, then back at Evelyn. His voice was heavy with emotion as he spoke. "Mrs. Evelyn, based on the evidence presented, this court recognizes you as the rightful owner of the property. The house cannot be sold, transferred, or occupied without your consent." The gavel struck the table. A gasp swept through the room. Sophie froze, Daniel's shoulders slumped in defeat. Evelyn closed her eyes as tears fell freely, whispering, "Thank you, Richard. I told you I'd protect our home." As the crowd began to disperse, Judge Harrison stood and approached Evelyn quietly. "You probably don't remember me," he said softly, "but years ago you helped my wife during her illness. You gave us hope when we had nothing. I never imagined I'd be the one to repay you today." Evelyn's lips trembled into a fragile smile. "Life has a strange way of circling back," she whispered. "Sometimes kindness comes home, even if family doesn't." Outside the courthouse, snow blanketed the world in white. Evelyn walked slowly, her cane sinking into the soft powder. Daniel ran after her, his voice shaking. "Mom, wait!" She turned, her eyes filled with both love and pain. "You have your home, Daniel," she said quietly, "but you lost something bigger, your heart." She turned and walked away, her silhouette fading into the falling snow. The same snow that had witnessed her son's betrayal now bore witness to her victory, not of property, but of soul. That night, as she stood before her house, Evelyn touched the door gently. The wood was cold, but to her, it still pulsed with memories. She opened it slowly, stepping inside, whispering to the empty air, "I'm home, Richard." The fireplace crackled to life, as if answering her. And somewhere deep within that house, the past finally found peace.